A millionaire banker pretends to be poor to test his fiancée's family. When he arrives at his in-laws' home, he is humiliated and then takes an action that leaves everyone speechless. Ethan Moore was a man who carried the weight of an incalculable fortune. Owner of one of the largest banks in the country, he lived surrounded by figures most people couldn't even imagine. Yet, to outsiders he was surprisingly discreet. His clothing was elegant but never flashy, and his presence at social events was rare. Ethan preferred spending evenings in the silence of his expansive library, surrounded by dark wooden walls and ancient books, reflecting on the complexities of life and love. He knew that wealth attracted attention, but not always sincere attention. In this introspective setting, Ethan met Sophie, a young woman who, to his eyes, seemed not to belong to this superficial world. Sophie worked at a small art gallery and had a sparkle in her eyes that reflected her passion for each painting she described to visitors. She was kind. Her words were gentle but meaningful. When Ethan entered the gallery for the first time, he was captivated not by the art but by her. There, in front of an oil-on-canvas landscape, a conversation began that would change their lives. She had no idea who he was, and most importantly, she didn't seem to care. Ethan admired Sophie for what he considered a rarity, her authenticity. She spoke with simplicity and possessed a charm that required nothing in return. He began visiting the gallery almost daily, just to hear her voice and watch her gestures as she described the stories behind each artwork. When they finally had their first dinner together, he realized he wasn't just in love, he was enchanted. Sophie seemed to view the world in a way he had long forgotten. However, something about Sophie worried Ethan. While she was transparent and sweet, he sensed her family was shrouded in layers he couldn't decipher. On rare occasions, Sophie mentioned her parents with a tone that was almost formal, always emphasizing their strong opinions about everything. This sparked unease in Ethan's heart because he knew that in his world, honesty was a treasure rarer than gold. One day, while walking in a quiet park, Sophie brought up the subject. "My parents want to meet you," she said with a hesitant smile. "They're a bit traditional, you know? They like to know who I'll be spending my life with." Ethan held her hand, trying to reassure her. "That's fine, Sophie. I want to meet them too. It's important to know not just you, but your story, your family." He smiled, but a shadow of doubt crossed his mind. The truth was, Ethan wasn't naive. He had grown up surrounded by people who hid their intentions behind smiles. His business ventures had taught him to recognize false enthusiasm, veiled distrust, and interest disguised as friendship. That's why, even though he trusted Sophie, he needed to ensure their love would not be corrupted by external forces. He knew marriage was not just between two people, but also between two worlds that could clash. Returning home that evening, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in his favorite armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand, gazing at the city lights through the window. The mansion was grand but empty. It was Sophie who filled the space in his life with something money could never buy: warmth. Still, he couldn't ignore the doubts growing about how his relationship with her family would unfold. After all, he had heard rumors and fragments of stories indicating that the Bennetts, as they were known, had very defined expectations for their daughters' lives. Ethan knew marriage couldn't just be about love. It required trust, respect, and above all, truth. This realization gave birth to an idea. He needed to look beyond the surface and understand who Sophie's parents really were before taking the next step. No matter how much he loved Sophie, he couldn't overlook the impact her family would have on their lives. Ethan's heart was torn between hope and fear, but one thing was certain. He was willing to go to any lengths to protect the love he cherished so much. That night, as the sky turned a deep blue, Ethan made a silent decision. He would meet the Bennett family, but on his own terms. Not as the millionaire banker the world knew, but as an ordinary man, to uncover the truth behind appearances. Ethan Moore observed the flickering city lights as his loyal assistant, Gregory, entered the office. Gregory was more than an employee. He was the person Ethan trusted the most. Dressed in his usual impeccable gray suit, Gregory carried a folder of documents but paused when he noticed Ethan's thoughtful expression. "You seem distant today, sir," Gregory remarked, placing the folder on the desk. Ethan, still gazing out the window, replied, "Gregory, I'll need your help with something out of the ordinary." Gregory, ever discreet, pulled up a chair and sat attentively. Ethan turned to him and continued, his voice low but firm. "I'm about to get married, but before I do, I need to be sure of something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've heard rumors about Sophie's parents. They're said to be opportunistic, even manipulative. I want to know who they really are. Not the version they show to a millionaire banker, but who they are when they think I'm on the same level as them." Intrigued, Gregory furrowed his brow. "What are you planning to do, sir?" Ethan allowed a slight, almost mischievous smile to appear. "I want to present myself to them as an ordinary man. Someone without fortune, without status. I'll disguise my true identity and see how they treat me. If there's one thing money has taught me, it's that a person's character reveals itself when there's nothing to gain." Gregory crossed his arms and sighed deeply. "This is risky, sir. What if Miss Sophie finds out? Wouldn't it be a betrayal of her trust?" Ethan shook his head, his gaze steady. "I'm not testing Sophie, Gregory. I trust her. What I'm testing is the world around her. I don't want her to bear the burden of a marriage poisoned by hidden motives." "And the plan? How exactly do you intend to do this?" Gregory asked, already anticipating that his life was about to become more complicated. Ethan rose and walked across the office to a discreet door leading to a small closet. Inside, he pulled out a worn coat and a pair of scuffed boots. "I'll dress like this. No luxury cars or expensive suits. I'll go to their house as an ordinary man, someone barely making ends meet. I want to see how they react to me without the weight of my name." Gregory couldn't help but smile as he saw Ethan holding the worn coat. "This will require more than just old clothes, sir. The way you speak, your manners, everything about you screams Ethan Moore." Ethan chuckled softly. "That's why I'll need your help. Teach me how to seem more ordinary, like someone who lives on the basics. Oh, and get me a simple car. Something no one would look at twice." "I can do that," Gregory replied, though his expression remained concerned. "Even so, this sounds more like a dangerous game than a safe plan. What if they're not who you expect? Are you prepared for what you might discover?" Ethan sat back down, his seriousness evident. "Gregory, this isn't just about them. It's about the future I want to build with Sophie. If I can't fully trust her family, how can I protect her from the consequences of that?" In the days that followed, Gregory dedicated himself to transforming Ethan into an ordinary man. He brought simple clothes, coached Ethan on how to carry himself, and even suggested that he create a modest backstory for his life. "Say you work in a repair shop," Gregory suggested, adjusting Ethan's tone as he rehearsed the fictional story. "Something respectable but simple. It'll keep curiosity at bay." Ethan immersed himself in the role, leaving behind the air of authority that accompanied him in business. He practiced a more casual tone of voice and even began walking with less confidence. A subtle but essential change. "It's almost convincing," Gregory admitted after a day of practice. "But remember, sir, it's more than appearances. You need to feel what you're portraying. Be humble but keep your head high." When the day of the visit arrived, Gregory handed him the keys to an old gray sedan. "It's time, sir," he said, a mix of nervousness and pride in his voice. "You have a plan, but the rest depends on how they react. Don't underestimate anyone." Ethan gave one last look in the mirror, adjusting the collar of his simple shirt. "I'm not underestimating anyone, Gregory, but I'm also not willing to be deceived." And so, with his heart divided between anxiety and determination, Ethan got into the car and started the engine. He knew this plan could change everything for better or worse. Each mile he traveled took him further from his world of luxury and closer to a reality he was about to confront head-on. The Bennett family's modest home was in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with old trees and well-kept gardens. The houses were simple, but there was a clear effort to maintain everything in order. When Ethan parked the old gray sedan by the curb, he took in the house's facade. The paint, though slightly weathered by time, still retained a welcoming shade of pale yellow. On the porch, neatly arranged flower pots revealed the careful touch of someone who valued details. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the open window, through which he could feel curious eyes before he even got out of the car. With slightly sweaty hands, Ethan picked up the small bag containing a bottle of cheap wine and stepped out of the car. His worn boots echoed on the stone pathway leading to the door. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment. Not out of insecurity, but because he knew this would be the first step in uncovering what lay behind that seemingly welcoming facade. He knocked 3 times and almost immediately heard hurried footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened, revealing Sophie, whose warm smile was an immediate contrast to the environment awaiting him. She looked as charming as ever, wearing a simple blue dress with her hair casually tied back. "Ethan," she exclaimed with relief as if she had been anxiously awaiting his arrival. Without wasting a moment, she pulled him inside, holding his hand firmly. But before he could respond, she cast a nervous glance down the hallway. "My parents are in the living room. They're curious to meet you." As he stepped inside, Ethan was greeted by a carefully arranged living room. Although simple, Everything seemed to have been meticulously placed to make a good impression. The sofa cushions were impeccably aligned, and the scent of freshly polished wood lingered in the air, as if someone had spent hours cleaning. There were generic landscape paintings on the walls, and a silver tray with porcelain teacups rested on the coffee table. Everything appeared calculated to look elegant, but it lacked the warmth of a genuine home. The first person he noticed was Mr. Bennet, sitting rigidly in an armchair in the corner of the room. A middle-aged man with neatly combed gray hair and a posture that exuded authority, his small, assessing eyes immediately landed on Ethan's attire. He said nothing, but the silence spoke louder than words. Next to him, Mrs. Bennet appeared, wearing a pastel-colored dress and holding a dish towel as if she had just stepped out of the kitchen. "Ah, so you're Ethan," she said, looking him up and down before continuing. "Welcome." Ethan offered the bottle of wine with a humble smile. "A small gift. I hope you like it." Mrs. Bennet took the wine delicately, but the slight curve of her lips made it clear it wasn't the type of gift she had expected. "Thank you, dear. I'm sure we'll find the right moment to open it." Her tone was polite but carried an undercurrent of subtle distrust, putting Ethan further on alert. As Sophie guided him to the couch, Ethan felt the family's eyes following him, scrutinizing every detail of his appearance. He sat down, acutely aware of his simple clothes and the stark contrast they created in the carefully curated space. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat and leaned slightly forward, as if already formulating questions to test the new guest. "So, Ethan," he began with a tone of casual curiosity barely masking his intention to investigate, "Sophie mentioned that you work, but we didn't get many details." Ethan took a deep breath and smiled, maintaining the persona he had rehearsed. "Yes, sir. I work in a repair shop. I do a bit of everything from basic repairs to more technical jobs. It's honest work and I enjoy what I do." He paused, glancing at Sophie, who smiled at him with quiet pride. But when he returned his gaze to her parents, he found different reactions. A raised eyebrow from Mr. Bennet and a faint, fleeting smile from Mrs. Bennet, who quickly looked away. As the brief silence filled the air, Mrs. Bennet broke it by gesturing toward the kitchen. "Dinner is almost ready. I hope you enjoy simple dishes, Ethan. We don't have the luxuries of a fancy restaurant here." Her voice carried an artificial sweetness, and Ethan caught the slight tone of disdain. He simply smiled, maintaining his humble posture, and replied calmly, "I'm sure it will be wonderful, Mrs. Bennet." Before he could relax, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A younger, more vibrant figure appeared, Sophie's sister, Clara. Her curious gaze and slightly mischievous smile indicated she was eager to meet the mysterious man. "So, you're the famous Ethan," Clara said, stopping in the doorway and crossing her arms. There was something in her tone Ethan couldn't ignore, a mixture of curiosity and condescension that suggested the evening was far from over. As Clara entered the room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. She took a long look at Ethan, as if trying to decipher him in mere seconds. "You really work in a repair shop?" she asked with a curiosity that seemed genuine but was tinged with mild mockery. Ethan remained calm, smiling politely. "Yes, I do a bit of everything. It's work I take pride in." But before he could elaborate, Mr. Bennet interrupted with a muffled laugh. "A humble job, no doubt." Mr. Bennet's tone was crystal clear, and there was no need to read between the lines. Ethan noticed the fleeting glance the man exchanged with Mrs. Bennet, as if they were sharing an inside joke. "Sophie told us you're very dedicated," Mrs. Bennet said, emphasizing dedicated in a way that felt almost cruel. "That says a lot about you, dear." She smiled, but it was a thin smile, more a weapon than a gesture of affection. Sophie, seated next to Ethan, appeared uncomfortable. Her hand touched his lightly as if to convey support, but her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment. "Mom, Dad," she began with a trembling voice, "Ethan is an incredible man. He works hard and is very talented." But her words were interrupted by Clara, who let out a short laugh and shook her head. Sophie has always been the idealist in the family, always dreaming big. The room seemed to grow increasingly stifling for Ethan, but he maintained his composure. "I've always believed that hard work and honesty are enough to build a life," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It doesn't matter where you come from or what you do, character is what defines who you are." He cast a brief glance at Sophie as if speaking as much to her as to the family. The response, however, was a heavy silence, broken only by Mr. Bennet's faint clearing of his throat. "Character is important, of course," Mr. Bennet said, crossing his legs and adjusting his glasses. "But let's be realistic. A man needs more than good intentions to support a family. Don't you agree, Ethan?" The question hung in the air, laden with an implicit accusation. Mrs. Bennet leaned forward as if she already knew the answer and was merely waiting to savor it. Sophie, visibly embarrassed, tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Dinner must be nearly ready, right, Mom? Why don't we all head to the table?" But Mrs. Bennet ignored the suggestion, keeping her focus on Ethan. "It says a lot about you, Ethan, that you came here today even knowing, well, that our expectations might differ from yours." She laughed softly as if trying to disguise the sting in her words. Meanwhile, Clara, who had been leaning against the doorway, shook her head with an amused smile. "You're brave at least. Coming here knowing my sister. Well, let's just say she's always had peculiar tastes." Sophie turned to her sister, her eyes flashing with rare indignation. "Clara, that wasn't necessary." But Clara simply shrugged as if she had done nothing wrong. Ethan knew he was being tested, with every word and gesture scrutinized. But he also knew Sophie was fighting to keep the peace in what felt like an emotional battlefield. He decided not to retaliate but instead to hold on to his integrity. "I think we all want the best for Sophie," he said calmly. "And I believe the best for her is someone who treats her with respect and is willing to build something real together." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Mr. Bennet adjusted himself in his chair, seemingly pondering the response, while Mrs. Bennet exchanged a quick glance with Clara. Sophie squeezed Ethan's hand tighter, silently thanking him for his stance. But the confrontation was far from over, and Ethan could feel it was just the beginning. Dinner was served, and the dining table looked like something out of a magazine, with every detail meticulously arranged to impress. There were porcelain plates with golden edges, gleaming silverware, and an immaculately pressed white tablecloth. Ethan, seated at one end of the table, thanked Mrs. Bennet for her effort, but the smile he received in return was sharper than friendly. "Of course, dear," she replied, serving herself with an exaggerated air of superiority. "We like to maintain certain standards in this house." As dinner progressed, the questions began, seemingly harmless at first. Mr. Bennet looked at Ethan over his wine glass, his eyes gleaming with poorly disguised curiosity. "So, Ethan," he said, setting the glass back on its saucer with a controlled motion, "tell me, how exactly did you get started in your career? It must have been an interesting journey to get here." The words were carefully measured, but the tone betrayed his true intent. He wanted to know how low Ethan had started. Ethan, maintaining his composure, responded calmly. "I started young, learning from a local mechanic. It was hands-on work and I've always enjoyed solving problems. Today I have plenty of experience and work with a good team." He kept it simple, avoiding details that might expose his fabrication. But his response seemed to spark something in Sophie's parents, especially Mr. Bennet, who raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Interesting," Mr. Bennet remarked as he cut into his piece of meat. "It's not often we see young people these days satisfied with so little. Admirable, in a way, though of course not the kind of ambition one would expect for someone thinking of starting a family." The words hung in the air like a veiled challenge. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling Sophie shift uncomfortably beside him. "Dad, that's unnecessary," Sophie interjected, her voice firmer than before. "Ethan is an honest, hard-working man, and he doesn't need great wealth to be amazing." But Mrs. Bennet quickly chimed in, seemingly determined to maintain control of the conversation. "Oh, darling, we're not criticizing. We just want to understand how he plans to give you everything you deserve. After all, marriage is a big step." Each word made it increasingly clear to Ethan that he was being meticulously scrutinized. Mrs. Bennet, with her sweet tone, hid sharp blades. "Don't you think it's a bit risky, Ethan? I mean, a job so unstable these days. A repair shop could close at any moment, couldn't it? Or do you already have plans for something bigger?" The question was laced with scorn, but Ethan, staying composed, replied politely. "I believe stability comes from consistent effort. I have confidence in what I do and my ability to grow over time." Mr. Bennet chuckled, a short, dry sound, while pointing his fork at Ethan. "An optimist, I see. Well, that's something. But tell me, what exactly attracted you to my daughter? I mean, Sophie has always been special and, well, she's not the kind of woman who settles for just anything." It was a low blow, a clear attempt to expose Ethan as someone unworthy. Sophie reacted, her voice rising slightly. "That's ridiculous, Dad. Ethan treats me like no one ever has. He respects me, values me, and that's what matters." Mrs. Bennet sighed, feigning patience she clearly didn't feel. "Calm down, dear. We're just trying to understand. We only want the best for you. Isn't that what all parents want?" But the look she gave Ethan seemed more challenging than protective. Ethan, despite the barbs, remained steady. "Sophie is an incredible woman and I would do anything for her. It's not about what I have, but about what we're building together. Yet, even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of disdain and distrust around the table. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed everyone had stopped eating just to observe his response. Sophie squeezed his hand under the table as if to give him strength, but the battle was far from over. The dinner was turning into a veritable minefield. The table, meticulously set with softly flickering candles and fine dishes, seemed to conceal a palpable tension. Mrs. Bennet, with her forced smile, served the portions with the elegance of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. "Sophie dear, you never mentioned that your friend was involved in something related to more modest business ventures," commented her mother, the word modest sounding like a venomous euphemism. Sophie, uncomfortable, glanced at Ethan, but he remained calm, his expression serious as if preparing for something greater. Mr. Bennet, seated at the head of the table, quickly picked up the tone. His sharp eyes fixed on Ethan with a curiosity that soon turned to disdain. "So what exactly do you do, Mr. Moore? What is your line of work? I imagine your income isn't as significant as that of others who frequent this circle." The word circle left his mouth with an air of superiority, as if he saw himself above everything Ethan represented. The pressure mounted with every word exchanged, but Ethan did not falter. He remained composed, though his sharp eyes closely observed the smallest details of his in-law's behavior. Sophie, visibly uncomfortable, tried to steer the conversation away. "Daddy, please don't be so rude. Ethan is very smart and he works really hard in his field." But her voice wavered, and Mrs. Bennet was quick to interrupt, smiling bitterly. "Sophie dear, we all know everyone has to start somewhere. But marriage is an investment, not an act of charity." Her words fell like a sharp blade, slicing through the atmosphere with cruel truth. Sophie froze, flustered, her words caught in her throat. It was as if she were watching her life be reduced to a cold transaction. Sophie's sister Clara didn't miss the chance to add fuel to the fire. With a cynical smile, she looked Ethan up and down and asked mockingly, "Have you considered looking for something more suited to your lifestyle? Because honestly, I don't see how someone so simple could make Sophie happy. She's much more than that." Clara's gaze at Sophie was pure malice, as if she were deliberately putting her sister in an embarrassing situation. Sophie felt her face flush, and for a moment she wished she could disappear. What once seemed like a family dinner was turning into a battle of egos. Meanwhile, Ethan maintained his composure, but his eyes were focused on the true nature of his future family. With every comment, he analyzed, absorbing everything as though he were gathering data for a psychological study. "Sophie has always been very generous to others," he said calmly, attempting to return the kindness that had not been extended to him, but his voice was firm and precise. "I'm sure you taught her to be an understanding person," he said, looking at Mrs. Bennet, whose expression froze. She hadn't expected such a response, but instead of replying with any kind words, she made a subtle gesture with her hand as if dismissing the conversation. The air in the room was heavy, laden with a tension that could not be cut with knives. Mrs. Bennet, maintaining her facade of false cordiality, forced a smile and looked away toward her plate. "Well, of course, everyone has the right to try, don't they?" she said, almost suggestively, looking at her daughter as if seeking confirmation. But Sophie's comment about trying seemed increasingly distant, like a failed attempt to salvage something irreparably broken. Sophie, her face red and her heart tight, found herself torn. On one hand, her love for Ethan pulled her in one direction, while the pressure from her parents and the need for their approval pushed her in another. She knew Ethan didn't deserve such treatment, but she didn't want to lose her family ties either. She knew something was wrong but couldn't muster the strength to put an end to the humiliation. Ethan's eyes were fixed on her, waiting for a reaction, as though he knew the moment was approaching, the breaking point between what she thought was reality and the stark truth. And then, amidst the uncomfortable silence, Clara's voice cut through the air again with an even crueler question. "Do you have any ambitions, or are you just waiting for some millionaire to show up and rescue you from this situation?" Clara laughed at her own joke as though she'd said something entirely innocent. Sophie, feeling the humiliation piling up, looked at Ethan, her eyes pleading for something more than words. Shame consumed her from within, and she felt small in the face of everything happening. How could she defend Ethan without destroying what remained of her relationship with her parents? The answer seemed distant, something she couldn't find. The humiliation came not only from the words but from the overall attitude of the family, which seemed more concerned with status than with the person standing before them. The evening, which was supposed to be an opportunity to get to know each other better, was becoming a nightmare for both Ethan and Sophie. The home that once seemed like the center of the woman he loved now became the epicenter of an internal battle she didn't know how to win. Each passing second felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was becoming unbreathable. The dining table was set like a gala event. The long table was covered with a white linen cloth, adorned with silver cutlery and porcelain dishes with golden edges. Tall candlesticks decorated the center, while small arrangements of white flowers filled the spaces between the plates. Every detail seemed carefully designed to impress, but there was something artificial about the way everything was arranged, as if the goal was less to welcome and more to intimidate. When Ethan stepped into the dining room, he felt the weight of the atmosphere, where the exaggerated luxury clashed with the modest facade of the house. Sophie, seated next to Ethan, tried to hide her discomfort. She cast a hesitant glance at her mother, who sat at the head of the table, adjusting her napkin on her lap as if she were the lady of a grand estate. "Everything looks so beautiful, Mom," Sophie commented, attempting to soften the tension that seemed to linger since they were called for dinner. "Well, of course it does," replied Mrs. Bennet with a thin smile. "We take pride in showcasing what matters most to our family, class and attention to detail." Mr. Bennet was already seated, surveying the environment as though he were the host of a grand event. He looked at Ethan when the young man pulled out Sophie's chair, a gesture meant to be courteous but which seemed to irritate her father. "You know, Ethan," he began, pouring wine into his glass, "it's important to understand what it means to be part of a family with strong values. Sophie grew up with high standards." His tone was a blend of advice and warning, making it clear that this was not an ordinary family dinner. Shortly after, Clara entered, carrying a bottle of wine and a mischievous smile. She placed the bottle on the table with unnecessary flair and took a seat directly across from Ethan, crossing her legs with an air of amusement. "I hope you like wine, Ethan," she remarked, casting a provocative glance at his attire. "This is a special label. I'm not sure if it suits your simplicity, but it's worth a try." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan placed a hand on her arm, signaling that it was okay. As the food was served, the atmosphere grew increasingly dense. The dishes, though sophisticated, were presented in a manner bordering on caricature, as if meant to impress with appearance more than taste. Ethan picked up his fork and began eating in silence, observing the faces around the table. Clara murmured something to her mother, and both chuckled quietly while Mr. Bennet, with an air of superiority, watched Ethan like an inquisitor awaiting the chance to ask his next question. The initial conversation revolved around trivial matters: the weather, local news, and of course Sophie's supposed luck in finding someone like Ethan. "So, Sophie," Mrs. Bennet began, her tone sweet but laden with underlying intentions, "you never told us how he asked you out. It must have been simple but romantic, wasn't it?" Sophie hesitated, sensing the trap in the question, but Ethan responded calmly. "It was sincere. It didn't need grandeur, just honesty." The silence that followed was broken by Clara, who let out a short laugh. "Well, honesty is always a good foundation, when there's nothing else to offer, right?" Ethan maintained a serene expression, but Sophie gripped her napkin on her lap, clearly indignant. "Clara," she said through clenched teeth, "that's unnecessary." But her sister shrugged, feigning innocence. "I'm just saying that grand gestures have their value, that's all." The dinner progressed, and Ethan felt as though his every move was being analyzed, every word measured. He realized that the family had not just prepared a meal, but a stage to expose his vulnerabilities. Even so, he refused to be intimidated. Looking at Sophie, he saw in her eyes the concern and love that motivated him to endure the evening. Yet he knew the worst was yet to come. As the main courses were cleared, Mrs. Bennet raised her glass to make a toast. "To Sophie," she said with a smile that barely concealed the tension. "And, of course, to Ethan for joining us on this special evening. I hope this is just the beginning of grand revelations." Ethan raised his glass with calculated composure, though inside he felt that this dinner was far from being about good intentions. The already tense dinner turned into a veiled interrogation. Mr. Bennet leaned back in his chair, holding his wine glass with an air of casual disdain. "Ethan, you mentioned you work in a garage," he began, his tone more accusatory than curious. "But tell me, how do you see yourself supporting a family, especially someone like Sophie? It's not a simple responsibility." Ethan placed his fork on his plate, maintaining his calm. "I believe a relationship is built on partnership. It's not just about one side supporting the other, but about both working together to grow." His tone was firm but polite, avoiding direct confrontation. However, the response did not seem to satisfy Mr. Bennet, who shook his head with a short laugh. "An interesting perspective, but a bit Idealistic, don't you think? Clara joined the conversation with a sarcastic smile. It's lovely to talk about partnership, but let's be honest. Do you have anything concrete to offer? I mean, besides enthusiasm? She looked at Sophie with a false air of solidarity. It's not your fault, Sophie, but I think you deserve someone with more stability. Sophie scoffed, furious, but before she could respond, Ethan raised his hand subtly, signaling that it wasn't necessary. Mrs. Bennet, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Don't take it the wrong way, Ethan, but marriage is a very serious matter. It's not just about love. It's an investment. She emphasized the last word, her voice laden with a theatrical conviction. And, honestly, I wonder if you understand what that means. Sophie could no longer contain herself. Mom, this is ridiculous, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. Ethan is more than enough. He's a good man, hardworking and honest. That's what matters. But Mrs. Bennet ignored her daughter's words, keeping her eyes fixed on Ethan. Of course that matters, dear, she said, her voice softening, which only made her words more cutting. But love doesn't pay the bills, does it? Ethan took a deep breath, but before he could respond, Mr. Bennet intervened. The issue here is simple, Ethan. Can you offer Sophie the same standard of living she's used to? Because, frankly, that's what we're talking about. The atmosphere grew heavy, each word echoing in the room. Even the candelabras, which had once seemed to sparkle elegantly, now cast threatening shadows over the table. Ethan has already proven who he is, Sophie shot back, her voice choked with emotion. You're being unfair and cruel, and this isn't about me or him. It's about what you expect to gain from this. But Sophie's declaration only increased the tone of provocation. Clara let out a short laugh. You're overreacting, Sophie. We're just being realistic. Ethan finally broke the silence that followed, his voice low but filled with determination. I understand your concerns, he said, looking directly at Mr. Bennet. But I believe love and respect are the real foundations of a marriage. It's not just about what we have, but about what we build together. However, before he could continue, Mrs. Bennet raised her wine glass, interrupting him. What a charming speech, she said with a cold smile. But speeches don't fill a house, Ethan. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie was visibly shaken, while Ethan maintained his composure, despite the weight of the insinuations. He knew this evening was more than just a meal, it was a test. And for the first time he realized that he wasn't just defending himself, but also the integrity of his love for Sophie. The air in the dining room was thick, as though every word spoken by the Bennets had added an invisible brick to the wall of humiliation they were trying to build around Ethan. He held his wine glass but did not drink. His gaze was fixed on the dark liquid, reflecting the flickering light of the candelabras. He knew he had reached his limit. It was no longer just about him. It was about the dignity that Sophie was also losing alongside a family that seemed to feed on selfishness and arrogance. Ethan set the wine glass on the table, his movements precise, drawing everyone's attention. Mrs. Bennet, he began, his voice sharp but controlled, marriage, as you mentioned, is an investment. I agree. But the question that should be asked here is, who is really investing what? Everyone's gaze turned to him. Sophie held her breath, unable to predict what would come next. He reached for the folder he had left by his chair and placed it on the table with a deliberate gesture. The sound of leather against wood echoed through the room. You're all very concerned about what I can or can't offer, Ethan continued, opening the folder and pulling out a document. Perhaps it's time we talk about what you have to offer. Or rather, what you're willing to do to keep what you already have. Mr. Bennet leaned forward, confused but still with an air of superiority. What are you talking about? He asked as Clara and Mrs. Bennet exchanged anxious glances. Ethan calmly raised the paper, displaying the heading that immediately captured Mr. Bennet's attention. Acquisition contract, Bennet property. This house we're sitting in, Ethan said, looking directly at Mr. Bennet, used to belong to you. But as many investors know, debts have a way of changing hands. He placed the contract on the table, flipping it over so everyone could see. Now this house is mine. An overwhelming silence took over the room. Clara, who moments ago had seemed so full of herself, froze, her mouth agape. Mrs. Bennet's eyes widened in shock, her hand trembling as she held her fork. Mr. Bennet tried to speak, but his voice faltered. This is impossible, he murmured, taking the paper with trembling fingers. But the official seals and signatures left no doubt. Ethan, however, didn't stop there. He pulled another document from the folder and placed it on the table. And to make sure there was no doubt about this family's intentions, I decided to do a little more digging. He pressed a button on his phone, and the sound of a recording began to fill the room. It was Mrs. Bennet's voice talking to Clara. If Sophie marries him, we'll make sure she gets the house no matter what. He seems naive enough to fall for it. Sophie, shocked, placed her hands over her mouth as tears began to well up in her eyes. It can't be, she whispered, looking at her mother, who now appeared as pale as a ghost. Ethan continued, his voice steady. I wanted to believe Sophie was an exception, and she is. But you? Every word, every action from you tonight only confirmed what I already knew. Clara tried to intervene, her voice desperate. That was taken out of context. It wasn't like that. But Ethan merely raised a hand to silence her. You underestimated me, Clara. You underestimated what it means to truly love someone. Because while you're concerned with what you can gain, I only care about what I can build beside Sophie. He looked at her with tenderness, but the weight of the revelation hung between them as the Bennets were finally unmasked. The silence that followed Ethan's revelation was almost deafening. All eyes were on the documents spread across the table, as if they were a sentence of guilt. Mr. Bennet seemed frozen, his face rigid and pale. Mrs. Bennet, who until then had maintained a haughty posture, now had trembling lips and wide eyes. Clara was the first to break the silence, her voice filled with a desperate nervousness. Ethan, this was a misunderstanding. We never meant to offend you. It was just concern. Ethan remained silent, staring at Clara with an expression of indifference. Sophie, sitting beside him, seemed petrified. Her eyes were fixed on her mother, as if searching for some explanation, some fragment of truth that could justify everything that had happened. But Mrs. Bennet didn't look at her daughter. Instead, she turned to Ethan, her voice now soft and submissive. Dear, you need to understand. We just wanted what's best for Sophie. That's right, Mr. Bennet agreed, finally recovering his voice. He adjusted his collar, clearly uncomfortable but trying to sound convincing. It was a misunderstanding. We never meant to, well, make it seem like we didn't trust you. It was all out of care, just that. He gestured exaggeratedly, as though trying to erase the impact of his previous words. Clara, who had previously acted with arrogance, now leaned over the table, trying to appeal directly to Ethan. You have to believe us. Everything we said was impulsive. Maybe we were harsh, but it was a mistake. Sophie deserves someone like you, truly. Her voice trembled, and the confidence she had exuded earlier in the evening had turned into desperation. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice low but filled with a firmness that cut through the air. You weren't worried about Sophie. You were worried about what you could gain. Every word, every insinuation you made tonight reflected your true intentions. You weren't trying to protect me or protect Sophie. You were protecting yourselves. Mrs. Bennet tried to laugh, but the sound was forced and awkward. Ethan, dear, you're exaggerating. We're a family after all. And now that you'll be part of it, we need to learn to trust each other. She extended her hand as though expecting Ethan to shake it, but he didn't even glance at the gesture. Sophie watched everything in silence, her breathing quickening as tears began to fill her eyes. We can't change the past, Mrs. Bennet continued, desperate to soften the situation. But we can start over. Look, all we want is for you to feel welcome. It wasn't our intention to make you feel this way. Her words sounded empty, each phrase carefully calculated to minimize the impact of the recordings that Ethan had just exposed. Sophie finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost inaudible, but filled with emotion. You were planning to manipulate all of this for money? Mom, Dad, how could you? Her expression was one of pure disgust, and the tears finally streamed down her cheeks. Mrs. Bennet tried to approach her daughter, but Sophie instinctively recoiled as if she couldn't bear the touch of her mother. The room had become a stage for a family drama that had been hidden for far too long. Clara tried to maintain her composure, but the mask had already fallen. Mr. Bennet stared at the table, too ashamed to face Ethan or Sophie. Mrs. Bennet, still clinging to her false sweetness, insisted on calling Ethan dear, but the word now sounded more like a desperate attempt to save face. And in the midst of it all, Sophie saw for the first time the true character of her family, feeling the weight of a disappointment that words could not describe. Ethan stood slowly, pushing his chair back with calm precision, but the tension on his face was evident. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on each face. First on Mr. Bennet, who avoided eye contact, then on Clara, who still wore a nervous smile, and finally on Mrs. Bennet, who seemed ready to open her mouth to make yet another attempt at appeasing him. But Ethan raised his hand, silencing any argument before it could even begin. He then turned to Sophie, who was still sitting, her eyes fixed on the table and her hands trembling in her lap. His tone was gentler as he spoke to her, but still held the same firmness he had shown throughout the night. "Sophie," he began, and her name seemed to echo in the room. "I came here tonight because I believe in us. I believe in you. But what happened here made one thing very clear. The future I want to build with you cannot include this." Sophie lifted her eyes, her face streaked with tears. Ethan stepped closer and held her hands, his expression now filled with a mixture of sadness and resolution. "I know it's not easy," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "They are your family. But what you decide today will define our future. I can't share my life with falseness, manipulation, and greed. I can't and I won't." Mrs. Bennet, alarmed, stood up abruptly. "Dear, you're being dramatic," she exclaimed, trying to intervene. But the look Ethan gave her was enough to make her retreat. "Dramatic?" he replied, his voice now harder. "No, I'm being honest. Maybe that's something you don't understand, but honesty is the foundation of everything I want to build." Mr. Bennet cleared his throat, finally rising from his chair. "You're asking her to choose between us and you?" he said, incredulity in his tone. "That's cruel." Ethan turned to face him without hesitation. "What's truly cruel," he retorted, "is what you did tonight. What you've been doing to Sophie her entire life, controlling, manipulating, using her as a pawn in your game. That needs to stop." Sophie sobbed quietly, and Ethan returned his attention to her. "I love you," he said with a sincerity that filled the room. "But true love cannot survive in a toxic environment. If you choose to stay trapped in this, Sophie, I won't be able to stay by your side. It's not what I want for us. It's not what you deserve." Clara tried to intervene, her voice trembling. "This is madness. Sophie, you can't let him do this to you." But Sophie didn't even look at her sister. Her eyes were locked with Ethan's, absorbing every word. The intensity of the moment was suffocating, and it felt like time had stopped. The choice before her was greater than any she had ever faced. Ethan, sensing her struggle, took a step back, offering space. "I know this isn't fair," he said, his tone softer. "But sometimes, Sophie, doing what's right isn't easy. I don't want to lose you, but I can't pretend that everything that happened here is acceptable." He took a deep breath, his expression hardening again. "The decision is yours. But remember, whatever you choose today, it defines everything." The silence that followed was devastating. All eyes were on Sophie, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her breath was uneven, and her mind was a whirlwind. But one thing was certain: the truth Ethan had exposed could not be ignored. Sophie stood up from her chair with difficulty, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of the chair. The weight of Ethan's words still echoed in her mind, but it was the silence around her that suffocated her the most. She looked at her parents and her sister, who seemed uncomfortable, but more concerned about their own exposure than the pain they had caused. Her eyes, now red, found Ethan's, who was watching her with a mixture of love and patience. He didn't need to say anything more. The choice was before her, clearer than ever. "You knew," Sophie began, her voice low but filled with emotion. "You knew I loved him, that he made me happy, and yet, you used that as a weapon." She took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "How long did you think you could manipulate my life like this? How long would I have to be a pawn in your plans?" Mrs. Bennet tried to intervene, raising her hands as though she could stop her daughter's words. "Sophie, darling, it's not like that. We only wanted what's best for you." But Sophie shook her head, frustrated. "What's best for me? Or what's best for you?" Her voice cracked and the tears began to flow freely. "My whole life you've made my decisions for me. Who my friends were, what I should study, who I should date. It was always about what you wanted, never about what I needed." Mr. Bennet cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Sophie, this is absurd. We've always done everything out of love. You don't understand now, but one day you'll realize that we were right." But Sophie laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the room. "Love? You call this love? Love isn't manipulation, it isn't lying, it isn't using people. What you did tonight wasn't love, it was a game, a business deal. And I won't play along anymore." Clara, who had remained silent until then, stood up abruptly. "Sophie, you're overreacting. We're your family. You can't leave us like this because of him." She pointed at Ethan, her voice rising in tone. "He's not worth it." Sophie looked at her sister, and for a moment, the weight of all the hurt she had accumulated showed in her eyes. "And you," she said, with a firmness Clara didn't expect. "You always thought you were better, always tried to put me down. But you know what I learned today? The true value of people isn't in what they have, but in who they are. And Ethan is worth more than all of this." Mrs. Bennet collapsed back into her chair, as though her daughter's words had stolen the air from her lungs. "Sophie, darling," she murmured, now pleading. "Think about it, you're part of this family. We just want you to be happy." Sophie shook her head again, more tears falling. "Happiness, Mom? For the first time, I know what that is. And it has nothing to do with you." Sophie turned to Ethan, her face still marked by tears, but her eyes now shining with determination. "I choose you," she said, her voice firmer than ever. "I choose love, truth, and a future that isn't tied to their past." Ethan gently held her hand, his face full of pride and relief. For a moment, Sophie looked at her parents and sister one last time, as if searching for any genuine remorse. But all she saw was a mix of shock, disbelief, and wounded pride. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision, but also the freedom that came with it. And then, without looking back, she prepared to take the first step away from that life. The silence in the room was almost palpable as Sophie, still holding Ethan's hand, took the first step toward the door. Her breath was heavy, but her posture was firm, showing that her decision had been made. Ethan looked at her, offering a small, encouraging smile. Together they began walking, leaving behind not just a chaotic evening, but an entire life of manipulations and control. Each step seemed like a declaration of freedom. Mrs. Bennet, still stunned, stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over. "Sophie, you can't do this. We're your family." Her voice sounded desperate, as if she had finally realized she had lost the control she had always had over her daughter. But Sophie didn't turn around. "You may be my family," she said without looking back, "but I'm no longer part of your games." Mr. Bennet remained seated, motionless, his hands intertwined on the table. He didn't say a word, but his face was marked by fury and shock. It was as if the impact of the situation had paralyzed him. He, who had always controlled everything, now saw it all slipping through his fingers. Ethan gave him one last look, a look of someone who no longer had anything to prove. No more words were necessary. Clara, in turn, collapsed onto the couch, tears running down her face. "Sophie, please," she pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. "You can't leave us like this. Think about what you're doing." But Sophie simply squeezed Ethan's hand, as if that gesture was the answer to all their pleas. "For the first time," Sophie said, her voice trembling but determined, "I'm thinking about myself." Their footsteps echoed down the hallway as they approached the front door. The sound of the light rain outside began to fill the emptiness left by the voices that had gone silent in the room. Sophie hesitated for a brief moment as she reached for the door, but Ethan was by her side, firm, reminding her that she was not alone. With one last deep breath, she opened the door. Outside, the fresh air seemed to carry the promise of a new beginning. The street lamp illuminated the entrance to the house, while the rain created a soft melody against the ground. Sophie turned to look one last time, but not at her parents or her sister. She looked at the place where she had grown up, where she had learned to mold herself to the expectations of others. Now, finally, she was breaking free. Clara was still sobbing, but Mrs. Bennet seemed to have lost the ability to speak. She simply stared fixedly at the open door, as if waiting for Sophie to change her mind. Mr. Bennet finally stood up, but he made no move to stop them. Perhaps he knew that any attempt would be futile. Ethan and Sophie crossed the threshold together, leaving behind the house that had symbolized so much control and pain. As they walked toward Ethan's car, Sophie felt the tears finally flowing freely, but this time they were not only of sadness. They were tears of liberation, of relief. Ethan opened the car door for her, and before getting in, she looked at him. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered. He simply smiled, gently cupping her face in his hands. It was never an option. The sound of the car door closing seemed to mark the definitive end of that chapter. As Ethan started the engine and they slowly drove away, the lights of the Bennet house faded in the rearview mirror, growing more distant. For Sophie, it was the beginning of a new journey. For Ethan, it was the certainty that he had found someone who, at last, shared the same vision of true love, unencumbered by falsehoods or attachments. The sun began to rise on the horizon, casting its first golden rays over the small cabin that Ethan had reserved for the night. It was simple but cozy, surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the wind. Sophie sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky transform. Ethan appeared behind her, bringing 2 cups of coffee. He sat beside her in silence, handing her a cup before speaking. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low and filled with care. Sophie took a few seconds to respond, gazing at the steam rising from her cup. "I feel everything," she said finally. "Pain, relief, fear, but above all, freedom." She looked at Ethan, her eyes still a little red, but now with a new determination. It's been hard, but for the first time I feel like I'm in control of my own life. And that's thanks to you. Ethan took her hand, intertwining their fingers. No, Sophie. You did this for yourself. I've only been by your side. He smiled, a smile full of pride and admiration. Now it's time for us to build something together. Something that isn't based on lies or other people's expectations, but on what truly matters. Us. In the days that followed, Ethan made it his mission to show Sophie that their life together wouldn't be defined by wealth, but by purpose and authenticity. He took her to the bank where he was a director, introducing her not as someone to impress, but as his equal, someone he deeply respected. Sophie in turn began exploring new paths for herself. Encouraged by Ethan, she decided to reignite her passion for art, opening her own small gallery, a space where she could freely express herself. Ethan's commitment to using his wealth for a greater good also began to manifest in concrete ways. He donated a significant portion of his profits to community projects and initiatives that promoted education and well-being, something he had always dreamed of, but never prioritized before. Besides Sophie, he discovered that true wealth lay in sharing and making a difference in people's lives. And this brought a new purpose to his life. On a peaceful afternoon, as they walked through a flower-filled field near the cabin they had turned into their retreat, Ethan suddenly stopped. He took Sophie's hands in his, looking into her eyes with intensity. I made promises to myself, he said, his voice firm. Promises that I would never let greed or falsehoods corrupt my life. But today I want to make a promise to you. I promise that, whatever we face, honesty and love will always be our pillars. Because with you, Sophie, I finally understood what it means to truly live. Sophie smiled, tears softly running down her cheeks. And I promise, she replied, that I will never let fear or the past define our future. With you, I am the best version of myself. And together we can face anything. They embraced, the wind dancing around them, carrying away the remnants of everything they had left behind. Time passed, and their love continued to grow, strong and unshakable. Sophie's gallery thrived, attracting people from all over, not just for the artwork, but for the welcoming spirit she conveyed. Ethan found peace in finally using his position of power for something greater than profits, dedicating himself to building projects that would change lives. Together, they created a home where happiness was simple but deeply true. On a starry night, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, Sophie rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, both watching the sky. Do you think we made the right decisions? She asked, her tone thoughtful. Ethan looked at her, kissed her forehead gently, then answered, I have no doubt, Sophie. We chose what was true. And that's all that matters. And with that, they finally found happiness, not in wealth or external approval, but in something far more valuable. A love built on the solid foundation of truth and the courage to stay true to themselves. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Ethan and Sophie, subscribe to our channel and activate the notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and wish to support our channel to continue bringing more high-quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next exciting chronicle.